Welcome to our first webinar series from the ADF. I'd like to present myself before we start. My name is Beatriz Caiubi-Labate, or Bia Labate. I am an anthropologist. I have been studying ayahuasca and plant medicines during a great part of my career. And I am a research associate at the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, ADF. I'm also part of the steering committee of the ADF. As some of you might know and some might not know, what is the ADF? The ADF is a program of the ICEERS Foundation. The ICEERS Foundation is maybe familiar to some of you due to the recent very interesting and important conference that was held in the Brazilian Amazon, the second World Ayahuasca Conference. But in fact, ICEERS has multiple projects, not only related to ayahuasca, but also to other plant medicines and to advocacy programs and different branches of extension. They are based in Spain and the Netherlands. And the ADF is a recent program created inside this foundation. The ADF is an initiative that came to life due to the recent wave of progressive criminalization of ayahuasca use worldwide. So a lot of us got frequent emails, questions, consulted by people who had their lives torn apart, being accused of drug dealers, traffickers, criminals, organizations that launder money and so forth. And recently there has been each time more arrests and legal cases. And the ADF is the answer of the global community to this trend. We want to stop this trend and reverse this trend. The ADF is a recent initiative. It's not completely established. We are in the process of building this initiative. We would like to invite you all to join us in this effort, as together we're strong. As a community, we have more influence and more power. And we're very much open to all kinds of feedbacks and support and different ways you think you can collaborate with us, either information, money, networking, moral support, and so forth. So coming back to the main branches of the ADF, we have, let's say, roughly 3 main branches of activities. One is the most obvious and most immediate, that is related to the name of our fund, which is the legal defense dimension. So legal counseling, legal support, and so forth. The other branch of the ADF that perhaps some of you are less familiar with is the education branch, or one could say kind of prevention or harm reduction. And the third branch of the ADF is related to policy reform. The webinar series encompasses all these 3 branches, but of course it's more related to this idea of education and policy reform. So what is the ADF webinar series? Today we have the first webinar series episode. It's our inaugural one. The ADF webinar series is planned to happen once a month. We're going to have sessions both in Spanish and English. So we're going to try to sometimes address things in Spanish and sometimes in English. Not sure if we're going to be able to cover Portuguese as well. The webinar series will address legal and policy issues and different status of ayahuasca in different parts of the world. You can see some of these efforts already online on our website that has a session on a legal map that points what is the status of ayahuasca in different countries. But not only we're going to talk about the status of ayahuasca in different countries, but we are also going to try to address larger issues related to the globalization and expansion of the use of ayahuasca. So as ayahuasca is progressively consumed outside the Amazon and gains terrain in different parts of the world, more and more challenges arise related to this expansion. Challenges of cultural clashes, cultural appropriation, challenges related to globalization, challenges related to the very sustainability of the plants that compose the ayahuasca mix or beverage. So the webinar will cover a lot of these issues. Our main idea is that educating, having a dialogue and exchanging ideas about the expansion of ayahuasca is a means to prevent further criminalization and further problems related to the expansion of the use of ayahuasca. So in this sense, we are also happy to address some of the more controversial aspects related to ayahuasca expansion. For example, ethics of practitioners, training of practitioners, best practices, how to pre-screen participants, how to avoid problems related to this expansion. We will be announcing the content of our webinar series as we go along. And for now, this is my little introduction about what the webinar series is. And I will pass next to address the content of the following presentation. So the following presentation will address the case of the União do Vegetal in the United States. The União do Vegetal, or UDV, is a Brazilian-based ayahuasca religion that emerged in the Amazon and has expanded to the US and has passed a large process, a huge legal battle to be recognized by the US government, a battle that lasted more than 10 years and involved many dollars and many efforts and many tears and many stories that few of us know, but nevertheless that are fundamental to kind of, in a way, install a new paradigm internationally on the legality of ayahuasca use. So we're going to be following how this process happened, what were the main problems and challenges, and what are the main lessons that this case of the UDV can teach us, not only for the practitioners in the US, but also internationally. And for this inaugural session, we have a kind of almost legendary figure, a dear friend and colleague of mine, who I have in high respect, Jeffrey Bronfman. He is a master from the UDV. He was also the main legal strategist on the UDV case. And according to his lawyers, which I had the pleasure to meet once, he's almost a lawyer, or no more than a lawyer, because he involved his heart and soul in learning the case to defend this practice. And so he's going to tell us in firsthand the experience he passed through, but also a lot of technical and legal aspects involving this battle. So I speak on my behalf, but I also speak on the behalf of all our team. Jeffrey is member of the steering committee of the Ayahuasca Defense Fund with other dear colleagues who are here watching. And I speak, I think I can say in all our behalf, that it's a great honor to have Jeffrey opening this series with us. I want to thank him for his openness. And I want to explain how the dynamics of this webinar will be. I also want to share that this is an experimental project. It's our first session, so maybe there's a little bit of doubts or uncertainties. So please bear with us and support us in going through this. Jeffrey will speak. It's not very clear for how long, maybe half an hour, maybe less, maybe more, as much as he feels necessary to say all he has to say about this last 10 years. And then after that, we're going to have a session of questions and answers. So this session of questions and answers, I want to announce to all of you that due to the number of people in the webinar, your video and audio are muted. To ask questions, click on the Q&A button and write your question, which we will get during the question and answer portion of the webinar. I also want to remind you that this webinar is being filmed and it's going to be put available online afterwards. So don't stress too much if you lose part of it. And with that having said, I want to pass the mic to Jeffrey and welcome you on. Thank you.
Thank you, Bia, for that very clear and complete introduction. And, I want to really begin by expressing my gratitude to the spiritual power that brought me here safely to this moment to be able to share the knowledge that I've acquired over these years, which, as I'll explain, actually goes back more than 30 years in my case. And then also gratitude to the people of ICEERS for creating this forum for us to learn together, support one another, and giving me this place to share some of what I've learned over these years to be able to hopefully clear the way or inform people, to empower you to be able to make choices that will serve you in your own spiritual work or legal work or political work or work in healing that you're doing in relationship to what I consider to be the most powerful tool for spiritual evolutionary development and healing that I've come across over many years of searching and study. And so I wanted to begin in that way. And I also want to acknowledge, of course, the lineage that I follow. And I'll be speaking more about that as we go along, and the guides that have brought me to the understanding that I have today that have empowered me to be able to share what I know with each of you. This presentation today is likely to be quite dense in terms of the information that's transmitted or hopefully useful to you. As Bia mentioned, don't be too uncomfortable if it's all happening very quickly. You could take notes and there'll be an opportunity to clarify things in the question and answer session later. And then also this will be recorded online if you want to go back and reconnect with some what you might perceive to be essential elements later on. So I had my first introduction to the use of psychotropic plants within an indigenous context, spiritual context, more than 30 years ago. My first experience was actually with the use of peyote within the Native American church. And at that ceremony, one of the elders, inspired by something that he was feeling or perhaps recognizing something in me, said to me that as of that day, I'd become a peyote man, and that other medicine people, other peyote people would recognize me. And shortly thereafter, that started happening in my life. I started to be introduced to different ceremonial leaders among indigenous communities through associations that I'd made in my work as an environmentalist. I came into this work in part out of the recognition of the need for us to conserve and preserve the natural world in the way that the power that gave us life presented this world to us. And in my study, I came to appreciate that the strongest defenders of nature were the tribes and peoples whose culture and way of life were somehow dependent upon nature, or recognized the superiority of nature and our vital interdependence with the natural world and the responsibility of caring for her. So that view largely was what brought me into this practice, working with the sacred plants. And then I started to observe that among the cultures with the strongest capacity and understanding for defense of human rights, of environmental health, were the cultures that had somehow emerged from their relationship with the plants and had healing practices that were intimately related to certain plants. And among those, the tribes and the cultures who had a relationship with what I would call the sacred plants, among which I consider peyote and ayahuasca and others, to have a particular capacity for educating and bringing about meaningful social change. And it was within this dynamic of personal introspection and spiritual growth, along with meaningful social change, making the world that we live in a better place, that I came into the spiritual practice of working with these plants in a variety of different contexts, which, in addition to the Native American church, included the use of psilocybin mushrooms among the Maya Indians in Mexico and Belize, yopo among the Piaroa in Venezuela, and ayahuasca in terms of the encounter that I had with the UDV initially, and then subsequently being used to other tribes that use ayahuasca within a disciplined and structured and sacred context. So that's some of the background that I bring to this. I want to say that I want to also express my appreciation to each of you for giving this time to receive this information. I suspect that many of you might be anticipating challenges in terms of your own spiritual or healing practice with respect to your use of ayahuasca. And thank you for your trust in allowing me to share some of the valuable lessons that I learned in my challenge, which, as Bia said, went over strongly over 10 years, but actually went back before then in terms of my direct contact with the government of the United States around our spiritual practice and the challenges that emerged as a result of existing laws that exist in the United States and internationally in relationship to policy related to what are considered psychotropic substances, drugs, narcotics, and how our practice in terms of our health and our healing somehow could be misunderstood because of the existing paradigm that relates to the use of substances that alter our perception and alter our consciousness. And so I want to go back to kind of giving an overview of how globally this became a kind of a global conversation. And I think it's important to note that most of the drug laws that exist internationally today, whether you're in Spain, Italy, France, Portugal, Namibia, Russia, the United States, Canada, Mexico, they all have their origin in treaties that were signed by the nation states over a period of beginning in 1971 and continuing through 1988, or actually 1961 through 1988. So over a period of close to 30 years that really define the global systems for drug control and as Bia mentioned, prohibition or control of substances that the nation states have concern about. And interestingly, I think it's important to note that this view of kind of a global community, clearly something that we're experiencing today, where something that happens in one country, certainly in the United States, has implications all over the world. And I think that this is important for the movement to be aware of, in that actions that one person takes, perhaps inspired by naivete or not being well informed, could create difficulties for the whole global movement. There are very serious cases of prosecutions that are happening today in many countries all over the world that the Ayahuasca Defense Fund has been accompanying. And I think some of these challenges personally and institutionally might have been avoided if people had been better informed. And so that's part of our goal in conducting these webinars, so people understand how these laws came into be, why they came to be, and how we could orient ourselves in relationship to them. Because in many countries, the laws that exist in relationship to what are considered drugs of abuse can be very, very serious, involving years in prison and in some countries, even more severe penalties. So it's within that context that I want to give a little bit of a background of how we got to be where we are today, and the significance of the treaties that exist and the rights of different countries beyond the explicit protocols and policies that are embodied within the treaties themselves. So I think this awareness of the world being more of a global community within which, where what happens in one country influences the world, came out, of course, of the Second World War, where really animosities and political and social and dynamics that happened in one part of the world quickly spread all over the world, and including the use of nuclear weapons for the first time, tremendous destruction, genocide in terms of people being eliminated with or dispensed with, either because of their racial or religious or cultural heritage, and just all of a sudden a very powerful mirror, I think, was put in front of humanity for us to consider our humanity and the potential for harm. And as a result of that, a number of very significant initiatives were begun, the most important of which was probably the formation of the United Nations, which in its creation had designed for ways for how communities could resolve disputes or issues among one another in a more peaceful and ordered way, rather than resorting to war and acts of aggression. And among those were the institution of the Security Council, which was set up to try to provide for a forum for reasonable conversation as opposed to acts of war. And then also the emergence of a World Health Organization, which looked at global health as we start to realize that many of the dynamics of our globalization affected global health, that a virus that emerged in one place could be very quickly, because of airline travel and the times that we live in, spread throughout the world. And so this awareness of our being a interrelated community of humanity, I think, really came powerfully out of the Second World War and the formation of the United Nations. And one of the first acts that came out of this, one of the first treaties and one of the first actions of the United Nations was a declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I'm going to read from because I think it's an important document that is actually a document that many people who were seeking the right to use ayahuasca as a religious or spiritual or healing practice need to be aware of the fact that this is an agreement that exists between all the countries of the world that in many ways is superior to other agreements, and it's important for people to be aware of it. And I'll read directly from it. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of universal respect and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Whereas a common understanding of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance for the full realization of this pledge, now, therefore, the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of the member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. So thank God that this level of conscience and this level of awareness of the importance of the reason for government, the reason for the social organization, is at its core the foundation of the preservation of universal rights, to allow human beings to develop spiritually and in terms of our morality and in terms of our culture and education, that this is why governments exist. And sadly, we've seen throughout human history that often governments develop that come to disrespect these fundamental principles. And so, but this is one foundation of law that really supersedes the development of laws in other areas. So then in the continuation in 1961, there came to be proposed another international agreement related to narcotics control. There was the recognition that there were certain substances that were being exported and promoted, and that there was a black market around, of which it was perceived that they could be abused and that there was some danger. And so the first convention in 1961 was signed by many of the countries on the earth that began to put in place this system of what we call international drug control that came to affect the practice of indigenous uses and now globalized uses of plants within spiritual and healing contexts. But back in the 1961 convention, there were three plant substances that were the subject of international control: opium, coca, and cannabis. And these were plants that were recognized as having potential value medicinally, but from which other substances could be derived, which were seen as having the potential to cause harm, such as cocaine or heroin or even opium itself. And so the global community of the nation states created this treaty around the control of these substances, in which there was allowed certain provisions for certain kind of uses, principally medical and research uses. So that, for example, while cocaine was prohibited, opiates that were derivative of coca could be used to control pain or could be used in a medical context. Same way with other plants that produced opiates like the poppy straw. And the prohibitions against cannabis use were also defined within this treaty, where at that time the recognition of there being medical uses for cannabis had not yet come to the awareness of the international community. And so there were controls that were put in place for the control of the use of cannabis, which at that time was seen as a potential for causing harm. Then there was and so that's what defined the drug control politic or public policy around that time, recognizing that there could be medical uses, that there could be value for research purposes, that determining that medical and research purposes were legitimate and could be tolerated or encouraged, but that as a potential substance of abuse or recreational use, that there were going to be a system of controls that were established. Then 10 years later, there was a convention that was signed called the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances. And this convention, during this time between the mid-1960s into the early 1970s, there started to be experimentation with the use of other psychotropic substances, some derived from plants, others synthetically produced, that had a psychoactive effect, and including LSD and dimethyltryptamine and other substances, psilocybin as well, that could be synthesized and manufactured, and that there began to be a concern of abuse around. And I think the United States in this regard was very influential in terms of the politics of this. I think the United States government was a driving force in this treaty as a way of prohibiting these new psychoactive substances that were being produced, in perceiving that they could be abused, that they could be harmful, that there was so much we didn't know about them. And then I think as part of a response to social movements that came up around them, and there's some very good films about this that have come out in the United States, with respect to being perceived that this was a challenge to the social order, that these people were taking these substances that were giving them a different view of the world, and there were political movements and there were social movements that were generated in response to this new view, and so there was a response of repression. And after the discovery of hallucinogenic properties present in LSD and the subsequent proliferation of other chemical compounds with psychoactive effects, the second treaty, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, was adopted and today is accepted and applied by 183 nation states. Interestingly, it's in its effort to put certain synthetic compounds and their derivatives under international control. Certain substances that are also found in plants are listed within the treaty as well. Among these substances are mescaline, which can be found in certain cacti, popularly known as peyote or San Pedro, psilocybin, which can be found in more than 200 species of mushrooms, and dimethyltryptamine, which is also found in numerous plant species all over the world. In its formation, the drafters of this convention significantly recognized that these plants had been used for centuries, in some cases for thousands of years, in, quote, magical and religious rites, and determined that that kind of use required, quote, cultural sensitivity and tolerance by the world's governments. So this is a very important distinction that was right there, right when this treaty was formed, was the recognition that the chemical derivatives or creations of many modern scientists in terms of the production of LSD and other tryptamines and other psychoactive chemical substances had a reflection of origin that had been used for thousands of years within cultural contexts among tribal peoples throughout the world. And at the time, as the treaty was prohibiting the substances, in the commentary of the treaty, which explains what the intention of the treaty is, it mentions the continued tolerance of the use of substances that are used within clearly defined cultural contexts in magical and religious rites of plant origin. So this is important for people to understand in terms of ayahuasca defense. So these two treaties defined international drug control for a period of about 17 years until the next treaty, which has not been replaced, further modified them. And under this 1988 convention, it was a refinement to the existing systems for the control of substances that were listed under the 1961 and the 1971 conventions. No new substances were added in the 1988 treaty, so the complete list of substances that are defined as being under international control are defined by the 1961 and the 1971 conventions. And the 1988 convention also significantly affirms respect for nation states' distinct constitutional provisions and basic human rights in the application of drug policy. And this is really important in terms of this evolving global politic with respect to how to treat psychotropic substances that actually have a history of use going back thousands of years, of safe use, of responsible use, of beneficent use, at the same time as there's perceived as being a problem in terms of drugs of abuse. How do you reconcile that? And so this treaty affirmed the importance of constitutional provisions and respecting human rights. Also, I think the 1948 Convention on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is particularly important in this respect. And then also describes the importance of tolerating these uses. However, it also affirmed that countries were free to establish their own domestic controls that are more stringent and penalties that are even more severe than what was internationally agreed to. And this is a very important detail that people need to be aware of as well. To the extent that there are treaties that define international global policy, there's also the rights under those treaties, depending on the constitutional definition of the body of law in each country, to come up with penalties and systems of control that are even more severe. So let me talk now a little bit more about the United States. And I think it's important, a lot of the work that we're doing within the ADF is researching the different policies and evolution of law in different countries around the world, keeping current with the cases that come in and informing the global community of this still really very much evolving ethic about what to do, with respect to the use of ayahuasca. And as yet, the global community does not see it as a wholly beneficent and positive development in terms of the global politic. And so it's a moment that we're in of where this global view is being defined, but it's being defined often on the nation state level with the passage of laws that may be more restrictive than the laws that are suggested by the convention. So in the United States, we have a foundational constitutional principle, which defines the laws of the United States that's come of what's called the Bill of Rights. That was amendments to the Constitution of the United States when it was written, that defines the powers of government, that defines the relationship to the people. And the founding fathers saw the necessity of including a Bill of Rights that affirmed certain things that may not have been clear in the enunciation of powers of the government. And among these rights, the first listed right actually is the freedom of the exercise of religion, free exercise of religion. And this became a vitally important principle within the UDV case as we went forward when we were in a position of having to challenge the US government's drug policy in relationship to our use. And I think it's interesting to note that the two countries today which have the strongest constitutional provisions for the free exercise of religion, being Brazil and the United States, are the two countries where the use of ayahuasca is most strongly protected in terms of its religious use than really anywhere in the world. And so again, it goes back to knowing the laws of your own country and understanding how to work within your laws of your country. For example, we have a case that we've been consulting with in Israel now. And Israel is a country which has, like I guess other countries in the world today, where the freedom of religion is the freedom to follow the state religion. And that's the extent of religion, freedom of religion that you have. Many Muslim countries, this is the condition as well. I know that in China, there's actually laws that limit the free expression of religion. So this principle of the universality of the importance of the free exercise of religion is not universally held in terms of the constitutions of many countries. And the international treaties give deference to these local and national laws, even though there is this guiding document of the foundation of universal human rights that articulates religious expression and healing as fundamental rights that we as human beings have independent of the countries that we live in. So in the United States, this is a principle that goes back to the founding of the United States several hundred years. And as often happens in terms of laws and the way that they're written, or constitutional principles in the way that they're written, it's in the ways that they're enacted, that they're interpreted by the Congress or the legislature or interpreted by the courts, that the laws come to have their definition and their meaning. And so there was a case in the United States where what is really meant by religious freedom, actually there were two very important cases that came up with respect to religious freedom in the United States that kind of came to define how the courts applied this constitutional principle. And one truly significant case was a case that involved the use of peyote in the Native American church. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court made a determination that because of the concern over dangerous drugs, they made a determination that the constitutional provision for the free exercise of religion did not extend to the use of peyote within the Native American church or the use of psychotropic plants within religious and ceremonial rites. And they basically made a determination that at that time necessitated the passage of a law in order to affirm greater freedom legislatively through the Congress that the Supreme Court was willing to recognize constitutionally. And that's what the UDV case did, and I'll give more details about that in a minute. But subsequently, there was this whole question of, well, what constitutes religion? If we're going to say that the use of a controlled substance is permissible within a religious context, what constitutes religion? And what would be the kind of analysis that a court or a country could do in analyzing whether something is genuinely a sincere religious practice? And this was something that the UDV case is instructive about. There was, however, prior to the UDV case in the United States, a case involving the use of cannabis in what was considered a religious context. And the judge that looked at this case did a very, I think, meaningful and important for people to study analysis of what is a religion. Because one of the things that the Supreme Court in the United States said is that to have each person be a law unto themselves, for people to say that they had the right as a conscientious sovereign being to not follow established laws would be to court chaos or anarchy. And these were actually words that the Supreme Court used in its determination. And so there was this wrestling with, okay, if each person can't be a law unto themselves, and there needs to be some form of moral and ethical dimension to a person's practice, so that somebody can say, well, my religion is human sacrifice, or my religion is, some other form of antisocial behavior. The courts were wrestling with, okay, what constitutes a valid religion? And in this case involving the religious use of cannabis, which ultimately was determined against the person who was the religious claimant, this was the analysis the court made. And I offer it here because I think that this could be relevant in other countries or in other cases in the United States or Canada, where people are trying to make a religious claim around their use of ayahuasca or some other psychotropic plant material. And so the judge said that he identified 4 principal elements of what defines religion, and then a number of accoutrements that are often found in religions. And he said that it wasn't necessarily that all these things needed to be present within a religious tradition, but that these were ways that judges could use as a guideline of interpreting whether or not a practice was really religious or not. And interestingly, the UDV has every one of these elements, and that's, I think, part of what allowed us to have the success as we went forward with our legal challenge that we did. So I'm going to read these again. You could go back later and reference them, or I could put this on the ADF website so that people could, access these easily. And I've abbreviated some of these, but most of the words here came from the judge themselves. The first element is ultimate ideas. Religious beliefs often address fundamental questions about life, purpose, and death. So if you're looking at bringing forward a religious system that would allow you the right to use an otherwise controlled substance, a wholly comprehensive philosophy and body of teachings and moral and ethical structure is likely going to need to be there in order for the courts or the judges or the legislature, depending on how you approach it, to recognize that you are indeed a religious institution. Second is metaphysical beliefs. Religious beliefs are metaphysical. That is, they address a reality which transcends the physical and immediate apparent world. So this, again, it's important to have a highly structured and defined sense of beliefs. And I think this is where the anthropological community is really helpful in helping people formulate their thinking about this and helping make their case that their particular practice is protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or local nation laws that protect religious belief or practice. The third, and I think this is super important, moral or ethical system. Religious beliefs often prescribe a particular manner of acting or way of life that is moral or ethical. A moral or ethical belief structure also may create duties that are imposed by a higher power or force or spirit. So this notion that there are certain things that true religious practice encourages in terms of ethics, in terms of honesty, in terms of integrity, in terms of moral values, of behaving in a socially cognizant, responsible way, of working for the benefit of others. I think this is a really important element in terms of distinguishing a religious context where somebody might be interested in using a psychotropic substance for, kind of recreational purposes, or even, kind of self-centered, narcissistic, perhaps we could even use the word purposes, that there's something about responsibility to a larger community that's inherent in religions that addresses this issue. And so I think here it's important to just make this comment. People wishing to make a religious claim have to be able to show the existence of a highly involved ethical system. People who could be perceived as commercializing the use of ayahuasca or who are openly ignoring a country's drug laws might have a more difficult time in asserting a religious defense if that kind of activity has been shown in terms of the case that would be brought forward, is actually happened in the past against practitioners that tried to raise that as a defense. The fourth item that the court identified was the comprehensiveness of a belief. Another hallmark of religious ideas is that they're comprehensive. More often than not, such beliefs provide an overarching array of beliefs that coalesce to provide the believer with answers to many, if not most, of the problems and concerns that confront human beings. In other words, religious beliefs generally are not confined to one question or single teaching. And in this case of the cannabis use, the person lost because he said his religion was to smoke cannabis, and that was the foundation of his belief. And his duty was to smoke it as much as he wanted all the time. And that lack of awareness of his responsibility to the larger community and that wholly self-centered view of his use of cannabis was ultimately why the court ruled against him, in this case. There was even a moment in the testimony where he was asked by the prosecutor if he had a job, and he actually answered, and this is part of the record, "How do you expect me to have a job, man? I'm smoking, marijuana all the time." And so this is, part of the dynamic of why these cases don't turn out so well when someone hasn't considered these things. So then the fifth thing was the court noted accoutrements of religion. And again, these are not things that have to be in any religious or any group that's claiming a religious practice, but these are common elements. The first is the founder, a prophet or teacher. Many religions have been founded or influenced by a deity, teacher, seer, or prophet who's considered to be divine, enlightened, gifted, or blessed. Second, important writings. Most religions embrace seminal, elemental, fundamental, or sacred writings. C, gathering places or sacred sites. Many religions designate particular structures or places as sacred, holy, or significant. And I think this is really important for all of us with respect to ayahuasca, to recognize the relationship to the Amazon where these plants emerged as being a place that needs to be regarded as sacred because of what transpired there and the inspiration and the wisdom and the light that's going around the world because of this place that is so vitally important to the global ecosystem as well. D, keepers of knowledge. Most religions have clergy, ministers, priests, reverends, monks, shamans, healers, or sages. By virtue of their enlightenment, experience, education, or training, these people are the keepers or purveyors of religious knowledge. You need to show how these positions are conferred and the training that's required to occupy them. I think this is another vital element of bringing forth a religious defense, is being able to show how the leaders are trained, who they're responsible to, and how they maintain the moral integrity of the religious community in their administration of their religious duties. Item E, ceremonies and rituals. Most religions include some form of ceremony, ritual, liturgy, sacrament, or protocol. F, structure or organization. Many religions have a congregation or group of believers who are led, supervised, or counseled by a hierarchy of teachers, clergy, sages, priests, etc. G, holidays. As is evidenced by the etymology of the word, holy days itself, many religions celebrate or observe or mark sacred, holy, or important days, weeks, or months. H, diet or fasting. Religion often prescribes or prohibits the eating of certain foods or the drinking of certain liquids on particular days or at particular times. I, appearance or clothing. Some religions prescribe the manner in which the believers should maintain their physical appearance, and other religions prescribe the type of clothing that believers should wear. And J, propagation. Most religious groups, thinking that they have something worthwhile or essential to offer to non-believers, attempt to share or propagate their views. So this was the prevailing law when the UDV brought its case forward. And I'm going to refer to some of these things in the lessons learned section as well. So what happened in the United States was they had been tracking certain shipments of the tea. We call it Ayahuasca. It's popularly known as ayahuasca, from South America, where we were importing it, having already established a church in the United States and believing that we were protected under the laws to protect religion. And they had been actually tracking another group of ayahuasca users where there had been some complaints registered against them, and they were beginning to prepare a case against this other group, which was a Daime church that was in Oregon. And significantly, a shipment of tea that they had been tracking in Brazil came to arrive in Los Angeles. At the same time, a shipment of the UDV sacrament came to arrive in Los Angeles as well. And so they dispatched one set of agents to Oregon, and then the following day, and prepared what was called a controlled drop, where they delivered the tea, someone signed and took responsibility for it, and then the police were right there with guns and dogs and to press charges. In the case of our friend in Oregon, he was actually arrested and taken to jail. That didn't happen to me. His children were actually held at gunpoint, and so it was a very serious intervention that occurred. And so when this happened, we engaged with the authorities. We set up we had hoped it would be a 2-day seminar, basically to convince the authorities to not prosecute me and to explain that this was a human rights issue and something that was protected under the Constitution. And we succeeded in being able to put on a 1-day presentation through which we produced anthropological evidence, religious evidence, and medical evidence to the prosecutors, and then they considered whether or not they were going to prosecute me as a criminal importer of dangerous drugs. And we had some very esteemed scholars who were testifying on our behalf. A man by the name of Houston Smith, who is a personal friend of mine. He died at the end of last year, but he came forward and a brilliant religious scholar who actually wrote the book on the world's religions that's probably the most influential book on religious knowledge that's used in religious studies classes all over the United States at university level. Today, he had a television show in the 50s introducing the world's religions to a television audience when we only had 3 channels in our US television at that time. And he was a well-known and well-loved public figure. And so he testified on our behalf, speaking about the global use of plants within religious traditions and how the use of sacred plants actually informed many of the world's religions and were considered sacred by the world's religions. We had an anthropologist, also deceased, who I think Bia and many anthropologists recognized as one of the first people to come to the Amazon and study ayahuasca, Marlene Del Rios, who actually married an ayahuasca shaman and made her career around the study of ayahuasca, and she was a medical anthropologist at the University of California at the time she testified for us. Also from the University of California, we had Charlie Grobe, who was a psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry at one of the most significant institutions in the United States, who had conducted research on the use of ayahuasca within the UDV. And then we had doctors within the UDV and other religious leaders who testified at that day. And ultimately, the prosecutors decided not to prosecute me on the basis of the conclusion that it would be a difficult prosecution for them, but they weren't going to grant us license either. And they basically took the position, you go to court, you sue us, and if you could find a judge and convince a judge to grant you this, then we'll accept that, but we're not going to just grant it to you. And so our attempts at negotiations failed. So we were forced to file a lawsuit against the government of the United States. In our case, it was against the Drug Enforcement Administration, who enforces the drug laws, against the Attorney General of the United States, who is the enforcer of the highest legal authority within the United States, the highest prosecutor of US law, and against the US Customs Service and Treasury Department. At that time, the US Customs Service was under the Department of the Treasury, so we had to sue all these agencies whose policies affected our use, and we brought our case against them based upon the Constitution of the United States that guaranteed our free exercise of religion, and then on the basis of a law that was passed guaranteeing the free exercise of religion or restoring the free exercise of religion, which is called RFRA, and which we'll be hearing more about in the the next webinars to come, which was basically an affirmation by Congress that the Supreme Court's decision saying that peyote use wasn't protected by the Constitution, and that governments could pass laws, or the government of the United States could pass laws that were against religious practice, reaffirming a commitment to the free exercise of religion and passing a law that required certain legal thresholds to be met if the government of the United States was going to do something that would interfere or restrict religious practice. And that was the government needed to show that it had a compelling interest in restricting the religious practice, an interest of the highest order as defined by law, not just a general interest, and that interest needed to be narrowly tailored in the least restrictive means as it came to the religious practitioner. And I was part of a movement to get this law established, working in collaboration with members of the Native American Church who were most strongly affected at the time that this law was came out. And so this decision of the Supreme Court was made restricting religious practice in 1990. The day that this decision was made, I was actually in a peyote ceremony with possibly the most influential peyotero in the United States at that time, a man named Reuben Stake. I had already committed myself to conservation of the cultures of indigenous people and threaten spiritual practices and ways of life. We emerged from an all-night ceremony that morning to find out that the Supreme Court had ruled as it did. And I said to Reuben, together we're going to do something about this and change this. And we began a coalition that day that led to the passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and was the basis where 14 years later I was back in front of the Supreme Court of the United States with my freedom and my religion on the line, under the guardianship of a law that Congress had passed, correcting a decision that the Supreme Court had made. So I guess one of the lessons learned is that this is I think Martin Luther King, the great social justice advocate in the United States, human rights advocate, said that the arc of justice is long, or the arc of humanity is long, but it bends towards justice. And some of these things are political and social movements that are going to take time to build. And I think that what we're talking about now is a vital social movement that we're building that relates to the use of these plants that have been designed by nature, for those of us who agree, who see it this way, a higher intelligence, to empower us and inspire us to make more conscious choices and improve our lives. And so the mission of bringing this forward in a world where, as Bia indicated today, there's a lot of repression and threats of criminalization, is a challenge that's going to be a work that we'll have to do over time. And every country where we have success is a victory, and every country where there's a decision against someone in our community, where there's a setback, is potentially harmful to this vital larger movement. So the case in the United States, we filed our lawsuit, and the government responded with its defense, why it felt it was justified in restricting our religious freedom. And the government, and the arguments that the government of the United States made were very well researched. They had a foundation in both domestic and international law, and are very instructive for anyone who's going to be bringing forward a legal action in any other country to study, because most of what you're going to encounter are the same arguments the government of the United States made. The first was a concern for public health. The statement that that this substance, there's a potential for abuse, there's no known medical use for it, therefore it needs to be controlled. And in the terms of the United States, government argued that it needed to be prohibited, that there could be no exemptions for this law. It was too important to preserve this system of drug control, and that there couldn't be any exemptions for religious use. That was the argument that they made, and ultimately they weren't successful. The second argument that they made was around the risk of diversion. And this goes to the idea that there are some substances that are authorized that are otherwise controlled or prohibited. For example, the example I gave earlier about opiates, that opium and cocaine is considered an illicit or illegal substance. But when medically utilized according to certain protocols, it's considered legitimate. So this idea of something that's allowed to be used for illicit purpose that then becomes diverted from that purpose and then sold on the black market, that was the other argument that they made why they could never allow this to happen. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in that argument as well. And then the last one was what I referred to earlier, that the international conventions prohibit them from doing this. And they gave the story that the US government is a leader in forming international public policy and international law. And if they were seen as abrogating their responsibilities on this very important treaty, that they would be unable to lead humanity in terms of the development of our ethic as in terms of international law. And ultimately the Supreme Court, because of the witnesses we brought forward, were not convinced by that argument either. And so we prevailed on every level, on every count. And it was important that we brought forward experts on each one of these areas. In terms of public health, we brought forth experts that countered the government's experts that actually had superior knowledge and demonstrated that knowledge with respect to the government's experts on the issue of health. On terms of the risk of diversion, we had somebody who helped us formulate a policy of how we would conserve our sacrament, and ultimately we're able to, through negotiation, develop a protocol and a system for making sure that the tea that we imported for our religious use never was misdirected or stolen or diverted or sold outside of the religious context. And that was important, that we were able to present a methodology for doing that in our negotiations. And then in terms of the international treaties, we actually had the professors who were the people who taught the government's treaty scholars that their interpretation of the international treaties were mistaken. And we actually had somebody from the International Narcotics Control Board, who was the United Nations body that oversees the implementation of the conventions, to give his testimony that the international treaty that they were saying prohibited them from allowing us to use our sacrament and our religious ceremonies actually didn't do that at all. And so we had really good experts, and I think that this is something that we're working with in the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, is to provide this kind of really high-level expert advice to people who are contemplating going forward with cases or looking to, or perhaps are being in a situation where they're being prosecuted, how they could launch a defense where they could ultimately be successful. We were in litigation for 5.5 years as we went through the different levels of bringing the legal action, appeals. The government appealed our case 3 different times after the initial decision by the district court judge. In the United States, there's each state has a district court, and then those district courts are supervised by circuit courts, which are appeals courts for regions of the United States. And then ultimately all the circuit courts are supervised by the Supreme Court of the United States. So our case was decided in our favor on the district court level. They appealed it to the Court of Appeals for our region by a 3-2 vote, or actually by a 2-1 vote. The initial panel that reviewed our case affirmed, and we were given their assurance that we were correct in our interpretation of the law. The government then appealed it to a full panel of 13 judges, of all the judges on this circuit court. Again, the decision was affirmed in our favor, 8-5. And then they appealed it again to the United States Supreme Court, actually twice. Once asking the Supreme Court to deny the implementation of the judge's order allowing us to import and use the tea, which the Supreme Court denied, and then appealing it again to the Supreme Court, asking for the Supreme Court to reverse all the lower court's decisions, and the Supreme Court, in our case, denied that as well and granted us our rights unanimously. And so the success that we have, I think, is important for people to understand the history, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story of how this happened. There's a film that I produced that goes over the details of each of these issues and how we responded to the government's questioning of us, that is called In the Exercise of Conscience. And you could go online. There was a link to it at the ADF website, and also, and you could find a link or go to intheexerciseofconscience.com, which has a complete hour-and-a-half description of the whole legal process that we went through and how we were ultimately successful. So I'd like to jump to the lessons that we learned, and if there are questions about the specifics, I'm happy to answer those as well. I'm coming to the conclusion here. Everyone should be happy to know. So lessons learned. The importance of credible expert testimony. And it's really important, I think, that it be specific to your country. There's many countries that have prejudice against experts from other countries. So if you're going to bring a case forward in your country, you really need medical, public policy, religious scholars, anthropologists who are known in your country as your allies in bringing a case forward. I think that will be really important. And people who are looking to bring forward a case, that's something you could already be doing, is looking to find credible experts that we at the Ayahuasca Defense Fund could help inform with testimony that's been successful in other venues, but you need to have good local representation. The importance of having an ethical structure to your practice and avoiding commercialization, in the sense of that doesn't mean that you can't in some ways have people contribute money. We do that, it's vital to the operations of our church, but people don't pay to come to a UDV ceremony. The distinction between the support of our work by our members and the religious work where people come to drink the sacrament, we never have people paying in ceremonies. To establish a record of safety, to be able to show within your practice. In the UDV, we had the benefit of having an association with the UDV in Brazil, where we document the use of our distribution of our sacrament, and in the more than 50 years of the UDV in existence, we literally have millions of documented distributions of the tea where we could show that there's been no harm within the context of how we work with it. I think another lesson to be learned is recognize that the state has legitimate interests with respect to this phenomenon and legitimate concerns as well. I think if we take the adolescent approach that, I'm my own sovereign being and you have no right to tell me what to do, that ultimately is something that could work against you. I think recognizing the state as having significant concerns and legitimate concerns and interests will be really valuable in terms of engaging in a dialogue, which ultimately we had to do to secure our rights. Another important consideration is if you're talking about religious exemptions, therapeutic uses and shamanic uses at this time have not proven themselves, at least in the United States or Brazil, to be covered under the religious exemption. And while I think that it's a clearly legitimate argument as to whether or not these practices should be licensed, it's a different question than the question of religion, which is what I want to keep my conversation focused on today. In future seminars, there'll be more conversations about therapeutic uses or shamanic uses. But I think it's important to know that there have been a couple of shamanic cases in the United States that actually even surfaced after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the UDV, where the shamanic use was not seen as protected under the law, was not viewed as being religion. And so if somebody wants to bring forward shamanism as a religious tradition, I think that working with anthropologists and be able to show the similarities between your religious practice or your shamanic practice and a religious practice in terms of the criteria that I listed before, comprehensiveness of worldview, metaphysical view, ethical values, all those things will be important for a case or a breakthrough case or precedent-setting case that establishes shamanic use as a legitimate religious practice. Interestingly, in Peru, it's the indigenous shamanic use that's protected, not religious use. And so the question in Peru today is to what extent ayahuasca retreats that are set up that are non-indigenous have the same protections that the Peruvian law gives for indigenous tribal uses. But that's just an area for people to be aware of in your preparation of your case as you're moving forward. Another thing is the willingness to accept reasonable regulation. What happened in our case was, I mentioned that after 5.5 years, the Supreme Court affirmed our right to our religious practice. It was another 4.5 years after that before we were able to reach an agreement with the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Customs Service and the Justice Department about how we were going to accept certain controls, reporting requirements that would allow us the freedoms that we valued so much. And I think it was our willingness to accept certain controls and develop a cooperative relationship with the authorities that ultimately was one of the most important keys to our success. And today, really, thanks to God, we have very good relationship with people at the DEA. They'll consult with us about certain challenges that they're facing. We've consulted with them about difficulties we've had in importing our sacrament with certain customs officials in certain jurisdictions. And so it's over, the now, so that was in more than 10 years, we've been in direct, actually more than 12 years, we've been in direct communication and non-adversarial relations with the DEA. We've developed a very good relationship, even so much so that when there was when we were looking to expand the UDV into Europe and into England, I had a conversation with the second in command at the Drug Enforcement Administration of thousands of employees in the Justice Department, and explained to her that we were, she affirmed what a pleasure it was to work with us, how much respect and appreciation she had for me personally and our organization, and she asked if there was anything you could do. And I said, well, actually, you could help us because we're looking to expand into some new countries. And your statement from you in terms of your affirmation of your agency's recognition of us as responsible, law-abiding people and how we've adhered to our agreements would be really helpful to us. And she said, I'd be happy to do that for you, but it will never get past our lawyers. And so here's my home cell phone and telephone number. You could have the authorities contact me from any country, anytime, and I'll tell them about our relationship with UDV. So that willingness to form friendships and alliances with the authorities, not viewing them as the enemy, but viewing them as human beings doing their job with legitimate interests, who you can help, solve a problem in relationship to regulation or relationship to forming a structured relationship with them, I think is a healthier and likely more successful approach. The other thing that I think is really important and that has been problematic for others is what we call being a single sacrament church. The churches that say that they use ayahuasca, as well as peyote, as well as cannabis, as well as mescaline, as well as different substances, it's harder to convince a judge or a prosecutor that you're not just trying to use religion as an excuse for doing a variety of different things. Within religious traditions, I mentioned that I followed the Native American church and lineages that used peyote for many years. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion when I came to the UDV that this was my sacrament, this was my teacher, this was the path that I embraced. And so I stopped using, other substances. And I think that that's an important integrity and commitment to your spiritual practice that could make that could be helpful in if you're challenged around your uses, to not try to say that your church embraces all different kinds of practices. Because, for example, the laws that relate to cannabis, many cannabis claims, religious claims have come forward in the United States, and almost universally they've not succeeded as a result of the fact that cannabis can be so widely grown and so easily distributed, so widely present, and the government takes the position that it would, and there's so much recreational use of it, that the idea of an exemption for religious use is bureaucratically impossible, and that argument has stood so far. So if you have a church where you want to use ayahuasca, but you also want to use marijuana with it or other substances with it, I would counsel against that in terms of the likelihood of your success in defending your practice. I wanted to talk briefly now about some points related to globalization and the phenomena that we're facing today. In the world today, we've noticed that there's coordination between international drug control bodies. For example, we're aware of a case that's being prosecuted in Israel today, where the ayahuasca came through France, which has very specific drug laws specifically against ayahuasca. And then the French police contacted the Israeli police, and there was a prosecution in Israel. And there's been cooperation among different nations in cases that have happened in the Netherlands and in France. And so it's clearly we're looking at a time where the global community is developing a response and is in communication and coordination with one another. There are countries with draconian laws and no recognition within their own culture of there being any historic or legitimate indigenous use. This is the case in the Soviet Union now, where there's no government recognition, even though there are examples of psychotropic use among tribes in the northern Siberia using mushrooms and other psychotropic plants. The Russian law doesn't recognize that as a legitimate protected indigenous use. So there are countries that you need to do your homework if you're going to be going there to understand what the laws are, to be able to fashion your practice within that law or not risk the possible dangers and consequences and possible setbacks to the larger movement of bringing forward an ill-conceived case, which has unfortunately happened as well. Another phenomenon that's happening globally is a mistrust of organized religions because of the perceived harm that religion has done over many years, or organized religions have done. And so there's many countries where a religious exemption might be even more difficult to come by than some kind of a medical exemption or trying to show that there's health benefits to the practice. So that's something to be aware of as well, what the country is where you're operating and what the attitude towards religion is in that country, or maybe some kind of an environmental reason for using the tea is important as well, or cultural reason. There's also a fear of seemingly strange foreign cultural practices. So the idea of a shamanic practice using a psychotropic substances that involves practices and ways of expression that would seem foreign to in many industrialized societies is something that you need to be aware of, and no guarantee of the foreignness or the strangeness of it being something other than an obstacle that would need to be overcome in defending your practice. And the other thing, of course, is the cost of bringing an action forward. There was a case that came to my attention recently of somebody that was looking to sue the government of the United States in the way that the UDV did. And I could see a lot of problems that they would have given the facts of their particular case. But something that they hadn't even considered is what the cost is of suing the government of the United States, or suing the government of France, or suing the government of the United Kingdom. I think that before you jump into an adversarial relationship, you should build a coalition of advisors and people to support you, and try to approach the government in a non-adversarial way, seeking an accommodation through the Ministry of Health or through whatever department ultimately has the authority to interpret the law, the Justice Department in the United States. And so I would recommend a non-adversarial approach. These are very, very powerful institutions with almost unlimited resources who know the law. In many cases, they wrote the laws. And so be wary about having too defiant an attitude, imagining that you're in the right, because you could find out the hard way that you're not as right as you maybe thought you were. So some final reflections, and then we'll move to questions, is what it takes to bring about transformational social change in the world. And this, to me, I think was the biggest takeaway from the process I went through. I feel like I was given a doctorate level course in changing consciousness to bring about a change in law, to bring about a change on the earth. And I think that this phenomena of changing consciousness in order to change law, in order to have greater freedom, is really the larger movement that we're all really part of in different ways. And so I think it's important to see this as a work of consciousness. And in, you know, every document that we submitted, I was there reviewing every word, every comma, every citation to be sure that there was nothing there that could possibly be taken by the, you know, those who were in opposition to us to exploit, to try to deny us our rights. So precision and awareness, honesty, spiritual integrity, sincerity, having this be truly your path and something that you're willing to put your life on the line for it, and that this is your true conviction and your true faith. I think it was a really powerful element, that this really is our religion and this is our practice, and we weren't just looking for a way to, you know, kind of use a substance that would be controlled. This is our life. And I think that came across in the testimony and the way that we gave it, that was very compelling to the judges and to the officials who heard it. And as I said before, I think the elements of having a single sacrament, not mixing multiple substances, not being, no exploitation, no excessive commercialization, and fidelity to a tradition, having a comprehensive worldview with an ethical foundation, and having a commitment and a respect and a love for that. So that's what happened to me, what I learned from it, and now I offer myself for any questions that I could offer in response that I haven't covered.
Hello, Jeffrey. Thanks so much for your exposition. I think everybody's pretty excited with your words, and your passion and your commitment and your courage. They come across together with your knowledge. And I find this combination of personal involvement and intellectual dedication a great contribution to this field. It's kind of hard to think of people involved in ayahuasca without having any personal experiences. I don't think that is a rule that people should drink ayahuasca, but I think that in many cases it's evident that their personal relationship to ayahuasca inspire much of their intellectual and political contribution to this field. And since you were mentioning all these dear colleagues that passed away and that were important to us, I also would like to mention the name of Glacos de Souza Brito, who was also an important figure from the UDV, one of the founders of the DEMEC, the Medical Scientific Department of the UDV, and who played an important role in the case in the US, who has also passed away recently, also was a dear person to me. I also want to a little bit follow up on your comment that if you want to have success in your legal case, you should work with local experts, the importance of having credible people from your own country. So I think this is a tip, and I hope people can catch the bait that if you want to contribute to the cause of a better understanding of ayahuasca and better social acceptance, better credibility, better legitimacy, you can help by becoming an expert yourself. Much research is needed, much scientific knowledge is yet to be performed. So I think this is another call, in other words, that if you want to do something about it, you might, join your academic master program, PhD program, and try to start researching and writing about this, because knowledge is necessary, experts are necessary. As globalization moves forward, we also need more experts in different countries. And I also want to make a general comment about how you mentioned that internationally governments are related. So what happens in one country influences another country, and a single actions here might act like a kind of domino. It's very hard for us to know exactly how governments and intelligence units work in each place. But after a while, it becomes evident there are certain international patterns. So I think that this is another evidence that of the importance of not taking, impulsive of initiatives on your own, thinking you're going to do something great, because your actions might not only influence what happens in your neighborhood, in your community, in your state, but also in your nation and internationally. So I think that this is another plea, and the ADF comes with this mission to create a stronger community and a stronger dialogue, a stronger collective vision. If you're thinking of suing the government, or if you're taking certain initiative on your behalf, I would encourage you to talk to experts and to talk to people that are involved and that have a large expertise on the field to perhaps act in a coordinated manner. And in this regard, I want to make a kind of invitation for all the people that are following us, that the ADF is going to promote a community forum during the Psychedelic Science Conference in April in Oakland. So this conference is promoted by MAPS and the Beckley Foundation. It will happen from the 20 to the 23 of April in Oakland. And we have a special session to discuss legality, ethics, and safe behavior related to ayahuasca. I also want to remind everybody that some of the problems that were discussed and raised here by Jeffrey will be further analyzed and discussed in our next webinar session. Our next webinar session will be March 4th, same time, 1 EST time, with Jeffrey himself and 2 other colleagues. We're going to talk more specifically about the cases of the so-called new churches, legal churches or not legal churches that are emerging on the USA and that are claiming to have religious rights to use ayahuasca. So I would like to invite all of you to also be present on this next session, and just reinforce along the lines of what Jeffrey said, that perhaps non-adversarial strategies towards the government and other means of approach are less costly and most likely to be effective. So with that, all that having said, I'm going to pass now again for the session, the questions and answers, and remind everybody that we're mainly using the Q&A button and not the chat or raise your hand button for the questions and answers. So I would like to make the first question for Jeffrey. The question is by Strobus. Sorry, I don't know how to say this, if I'm saying correct. Are there any currently active petitions to the DEA to permit use based on the UDV precedent? Or do all cases have to go through the courts regardless of the precedent? Jeffrey.
Yeah, it's an important question. And one thing that happened was, as a result of our case, the DEA opened a procedure for people to come and apply and submit an application for a religious exemption. And this is significant in that as long as there is an administrative avenue open to somebody, you don't necessarily have access to the court. So because we had approached the DEA and asked them for an accommodation, and they said, no way, sue us, we had to go to the court, and we had access to the court under the law. Now that the DEA has opened up this avenue for people to come to apply, and presumably has a procedure in place for evaluating the application, that's the first thing that people have to do. You can't, you can continue to act as if you have the authority to do it, but if you don't have a license from the government, then that could be a problem for you later on, in terms of the government could say, well, we had this situation available where you could have applied. If you felt that you were legitimate, why didn't you do so? Or you were operating for this many years without being recognized under the law. So how can you claim that you're sincere? Or how could you claim that you're ethical? Or how could you claim that this is a valid religion? Does your religion teach you to disobey the law? So it creates all kinds of potential complexities. And so I haven't been tracking, the individual applications. I'm aware of some have come in. Some people have asked me about, for advice with respect to how to formulate an application. And but as far as the success of them to this point, I'm aware of the DEA having granted exemption to another Daime church in addition to the ones that were granted exemption by the court up in Oregon after the UDV case was decided. We have a procedure in place for the recognition of all UDV churches that come, within our organization, that we apply to the DEA directly, and they grant, a continuation of a new license or a new registration to that new church. But as far as accompanying those individual applications or what's happening with it, I don't have that knowledge.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Jeffrey. There's a anonymous viewer. He's asking, how important was it for the UDV to have a mother church in Brazil in the process? Simple answer, absolutely essential and vital. The UDV is really one church, and all the works of the UDV are authorized by a central headquarters, which is in Brasilia. There's several hundred UDV churches throughout Brazil, and to the extent that it's all, we've gone into other countries, all those works have been authorized by the headquarters. All the opening of new churches in the United States is authorized by a regional administrative council that's subordinated to the headquarters in Brazil. And so for us, it was vital to be able to show that our religious tradition was recognized and honored in Brazil, that we're part of the same lineage, that we adhere to the same laws, that we teach the same teachings, the same doctrine. It was, I believe, fundamental to our acceptance, the fact that we were aligned with an existing religious structure and not forming a new religion. Thank you, Jeffrey. Just want to remind everybody that I'm selecting the questions. We're not going to be able, unfortunately, to take all of them. I ask you for your comprehension. We're going to be doing some following up of this wonderful webinar in our Facebook page and also in ICER's newsletters and Twitter. So I ask you to stay tuned. We're also going to have a lot of other webinars and information being shared online. For now, I'm going to pass for the next question. It's from Jordan. I'm going to read his questions. Could you envision therapeutic medical uses of ayahuasca being made possible by making use of the religious freedom rules in the USA? For example, physicians working with the churches or opening their own church healing center.
I think, as I was talking before, that it's probably thinking strategically. You need to look at next steps. We're looking at an accommodation, for example, in several countries, and this question of, well, if we open the door to the churches, what happens next? And our approach with the governments that have expressed those kind of doubts is, well, let's start with the reasonable first step, where there's reasonable controls, where there's a history and a track record that we know that no harm is going to come from this, and then work gradually. And I know within the UDV, we have, as Bia mentioned, a Department of Medical and Scientific Studies that accepts research proposals from academic and medical institutions. We accepted one proposal in the United States for researchers in Brazil and New Mexico in a co-study to do a study on church members within the church. And so I think that this partnership between academics and science and religion, particularly within the UDV, who has a real openness to this and has had an openness to it going back decades, is an important next step. To the extent religion could be recognized, then researchers studying therapeutic effects within religion or health effects within religion, I think is a achievable next step, and also something that's open for researchers to know that these avenues exist. So that's my thought. I can't speculate about how the government would respond to a doctor trying to set up a church to do religious studies. I think that there's inherent, conflicts and problems with that. But for medical and therapeutic researchers to conduct studies in relationship to the church, I think is an avenue that's already open. The process for approving the research grants is a different process within the DEA, and there have already been protocols approved by the DEA for the study of MDMA, for the study of psilocybin, for the study of dimethyltryptamine. So there's already a history within the United States of qualified academic researchers approaching the DEA and asking for a license to do a study. I'm not aware of a study that's been approved for ayahuasca research outside of the use that was approved by the UDV. But I imagine it's possible, but it raises a different set of questions.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Jeffrey. Just want to give you a heads up that there's millions of posts popping here. People are very happy and got all rattled up by your speech. So there's lots of thanks and cheers. I want to say myself that I'm still touched by the passage that you read of the Human Rights Declaration. I think it was beautiful, and it's always refreshing to remind us that us as a global community have made certain pacts and rules about what we think is just and fair. And it's good to be part of this movement, reminding us that we are not creating we're not inventing the wheel. We're just trying to rescue rights that are in place to be respected. And it's not like we're trying to do some revolutionary underground crazy hippie alternative project, but we're trying to have rules that exist be placed in order and followed. There's lots of questions. Some people are asking where can they drink ayahuasca and how can they access the UDV. I don't think this is the place for us to answer this kind of question. We're going to keep more the focus on the legal and the political dimension, and our contribution as the ADF is to raise awareness on how can we put legal protections in place. And it's a little bit delicate to be referencing people to ayahuasca, either legal or illegal, so I ask you for your understanding. And I just wanted to ask you, Jeffrey, since you mentioned this important research recently published about the UDV in the US, I haven't seen much repercussion, and I think this would be an excellent opportunity for you to share with us what was this research a little bit. It was the research by Paulo Barbosa, our Brazilian colleague, with his associates in the US. Can you just tell us a little bit of the background of the research and the main findings? I think this is an important topic that has not been widely debated so far.
Sure. Paulo Barbosa is a research social scientist from Rio de Janeiro. He had been already authorized to do a large-scale study within the UDV, and he was in Brazil, and he was looking to expand that study to the United States. And within the process of evaluating proposals within the UDV, he made an approach to me personally. I brought it to our local regional administrative council. I also was in consultation with the department that handles research proposals in Brazil, and we evaluated the proposal. We made certain requests of the researchers that we felt were important for how this would be published and focusing on the research. And one of the essential elements of it was a study of the use of ayahuasca, but one thing that was important to us is that the research also emphasized that it's not the tea in and of itself that brings about the transformational effects. There's also the context within which it's used, which for us is within a religious context with a specific religious doctrine, as well as a communal context of responsibility to a community, which is also elemental to the transformation that occurs. And so in negotiating it with with you know, Paulo, and then we had the support of Michael Bogenschutz, who's a professor at the university. Well, he was at the University of New Mexico in the substance abuse studying different substances in terms of finding different ways of treating addiction and treating substance abuse. And so that was the area of interest that they had. And they looked at the issue of people who came to the UDV with the background perhaps in substance abuse, and how their practice had worked on improving their lives. There were a battery of tests that were done in terms of memory, in terms of socialization, in terms of ethics. All of these things were there to show how the use of the tea within a religious context had brought positive changes to the people's lives, and the study demonstrated that. Interestingly, there was a control group of religious people who didn't drink the tea, because one of the criticisms that we faced in our legal case was the government said, well, you know, these people claim that the tea is beneficent and helpful to them in their lives, but maybe it's just the religion that's beneficial to them. Maybe the tea's got nothing to do with it. Maybe these are good people who are doing good things because of the religion that they follow, and they could follow their religion without the tea. And we had to explain, no, the tea is a vital element of our religion, and the tea is what informs our ethics and informs our sense of social responsibility. So this study had a control group of religious people, went to church, religion was important to them, who didn't drink the tea, and did the same tests on them that they did on us in terms of mental functioning. I didn't study the results, but I think we came out okay, and maybe we actually were in some ways more functional and had kind of higher levels of coherence in certain ways, but I didn't study it. It went well, and it was a great collaboration. And once again, we made really good friends with the research community and friendships that exist to this day. And, you know, it was great for me to go to the conference in Ibiza and the conference in Rio Branco and encounter researchers that we would worked with and who were so happy to see us, and you know, just the friendship of this community of the social scientists that are supporting this work, the religious and the therapists and the different practitioners that are part of it. And it's really a great friendship that exists. And I think that was another factor that was really conclusive in the case in the United States as well.
Thank you, Jeffrey. As I told those of you who are since the beginning, this is our first webinar, so in many ways it's a pilot. What I'm getting here, and I'll make sure our team does, is that we're going to put online all the references that Jeffrey have mentioned. So we're going to put links, we're going to have passages quoted. So there's lots of questions asking for such information, like where do I get this and where do I get that, asking for the links. Don't worry about that. We're gonna have a follow-up on that. And now I'm going to take a question by a guy named Benjamin de Luna. He happens to be the executive director of ICEERS, and I think in many ways a dreamer in a good way, that he has envisioned so many positive things that so many of us were so skeptical. So Ben is the head of ICEERS. As it was said in the beginning, ICEERS is a part of the ADF, is a program of ICEERS, and Ben is participating with us, and he asks Jeffrey, in the UDV case, in the first court outcomes, the judges recognized ayahuasca is not controlled under the 1971 convention, while it contains DMT. But then the Supreme Court had a different interpretation, that ayahuasca actually is in the 1971 convention. Can you further comment on this, and what do you think of this? So Ben is talking about the ambiguity between DMT and ayahuasca, the legality of ayahuasca. It's a big topic. I also want to remind all of you that we're going to have a webinar on specifically DMT, but let's take Jeffrey's answer on this particular legal aspect.
That's a really good question, Ben, and thank you for it. And there was a lot of material on this topic that was part of the UDV case. And in the district court level, the district court judge accepted our argument that it wasn't controlled by the convention. And then the government persisted, and this is one of the main basis of the government's appeal in the United States, which was saying, no, it is controlled under the convention because it's a preparation that contains a controlled substance, and therefore the substance that results from that preparation is also controlled. And this is a very fine point of the law, which we're developing arguments about, but that was the argument that the government of the United States gave. The majority of the appeals court judges didn't accept that argument and went it along with our interpretation and the finding of the lower court judge. But there was a very strong minority that still believed in that view. And so when they went to the United States Supreme Court, they made that argument, and the United States Supreme Court made the determination that because the tea is a preparation of a controlled, that involves a controlled substance, in this case dimethyltryptamine, therefore under US law, it itself is a controlled substance. So the United States, again, the Supreme Court wasn't making a determination about the law internationally. They were just making a determination of, applied to US law, is it controlled? And because the agency of the DEA was making the argument that it was controlled because it contained dimethyltryptamine, and there's a deference to the agencies, the Supreme Court made the determination, yes, it's controlled, and we could still allow for an exemption by the UDV for their religious use, because in the reasoning, peyote is controlled under this same convention, or mescaline is controlled under the same convention, and we make allowances for the Native American Church to use it under our laws, so we can make an allowance for the UDV as well. So it's a delicate area of law, and I think it's something that's determined country by country. It's clear that the international accords do not control the use of ayahuasca. And it's also clear that individual countries have the right to make their own laws that could be more restrictive than the international ones. But we have documentation, which we've distributed, that make it very clear that according to the International Narcotics Control Board, which is the institution internationally that interprets the treaties, ayahuasca isn't controlled. And other countries have subsequently come in with interpretations that say that it is controlled. We think the Supreme Court in the United States got this aspect wrong, but it's not, it won't be our case that's going to resolve it. And I don't think that that's, the fact that there is in the United States an avenue for getting an exemption, I don't think it makes sense to argue that the Supreme Court made a mistake in its interpretation, because they have a basis for why they made it. And the fact that because an exemption exists in the United States, you're not going to get very far by saying that the Supreme Court made a mistake in its interpretation of the law, which is in its authority to do.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I want to make sure that we don't exhaust our panelists in order not to afraid the next to make the next ones afraid of the experience. We're almost headed towards 2 hours of webinar, so we're going to start wrapping up here. There's an interesting question, addresses a little bit the agreements between the UDV and the DEA, which in the end Jeffrey didn't have the time to talk to. Perhaps he could expand a little on that. It's by an anonymous viewer. He asks, did you have to provide a list of associated or a list of people allowed to perform ceremonies to assure the government that the sacrament would be used only with the right religion intent?
Simple answer, yes. The whole issue of who authorizes the person with the right to distribute the tea was an area that we had to negotiate, with the government. They have for example, there's a law that prohibits somebody who has a prior conviction for controlled substance use to ever distribute it. And there was an instance of one case in our community of somebody who was a respected member of our community who previously had a controlled substance conviction. He wasn't anybody that was currently in the process of leading ceremonies and distributing our sacrament, but we could see that through the process of improving and transforming his life, some years down the road, he should have he could develop the capacity and the right to do that. And there shouldn't be a government prohibition on who could or couldn't be a member of the leadership or the priesthood or a mestre within our church. And so it was something that they were sympathetic to, and we resolved it through negotiation, that particular thing. So the determination of who gets to distribute the sacrament is up to the UDV. What our agreement with the DEA is, it has to be conducted within authorized religious ceremony of our church. And then it's up to us how that's administered. The government doesn't tell us how to run our church, because that would be an improper interference of the government coming into a religious community and telling them how they need to operate. And so it was a delicate area, because in the part of the Constitution that I declared before, or that I spoke of before, that guarantees the free exercise of the religion, there's another part to that which says the government shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. And this historically comes out of the fact that the United States emerged out of the Church of England, which the government and the religion were in many ways inseparable, and prosecuted people who were considered to be enemies of the religion or of the church, because they may have had a doctrine that the church considered to be heresy. And there's a long history in British history of intolerance of that. So the founding fathers of the United States wanted to avoid there being a state-sponsored religion. And so this law, the Constitution of the United States, forbids the government from establishing a religion. So the question of the government coming into the UDV and saying when we could distribute our sacrament, or who is our churches, that would be establishing religion. That would be the government interfering with religion. And so this was another area that we had to negotiate and work out. But the authority to our religious practice is entirely ours. We are the ones who determine who has the authority and the experience and the necessary training to distribute the sacrament within our religion, and the government supports us in that.
Thanks, Jeffrey, again. There's a question asking, what is the relationship between the legalization of the UDV in the US and the case of Santo Daime in the US, which is another Brazilian ayahuasca religious that in certain states has gained the right to use ayahuasca religiously. I know it's a large topic, Jeffrey, but can you just perhaps share a few lines, and then I'll just have one final question and we're done.
Okay. It's actually it's a potentially complicated thing, but it's actually very simple. So when, after the UDV's case was determined unanimously in our favor by the United States Supreme Court, the Daime Church in Oregon that I mentioned before went forward. Actually, there were 3 Oregon Daime churches that went forward with their own case, asking for a similar exemption for the use of ayahuasca. And they used an argument that they were similarly situated to the UDV. There's a principle of the law in the United States of equal protection. And that states that if 2 people are substantially similar, the law can't discriminate in favor of one over the other. And this was highlighted recently by a Supreme Court decision that allows for gay marriage based on this principle, that the idea that homosexual couples were being discriminated against, and that they didn't have the right to marry, whereas heterosexual couples did have the right to marry. They took a case to the Supreme Court and won. So based on a similar principle, these churches argued that they were similar to the UDV. They were both from Brazil. We used the exact same sacrament. They had a doctrine. They had a theology. There were many similarities. And it didn't make sense that our practice would be authorized and theirs wouldn't. And so they went and they asked the judge, and the judge found in their favor, stating that even though the government said, no, they're different, and the government tried to give different reasons of why the Daime Church was different from the UDV and how they can't possibly allow the Daime Church to be allowed to function for these reasons that you could look up, the judge said they're not that different, and he found that the decision that the Supreme Court made with respect to the UDV also applied to the Daime, and he gave an exemption to those 3 churches.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So I'm moving here to our last question, and then I'll make a final comment as well after you answer. The question is by Robert. The use of ayahuasca has expanded in the US in the last decade, yet the DEA does not seem to be aggressively pursuing it. Could you comment on this? And if you think that this may change under the Trump administration?
Well, I'll give you a very simple, factual, hopefully not too political response. Drug policy in the United States is under the authority of the Attorney General, who is appointed by the President of the United States. The person who Donald Trump has appointed to be the Attorney General of the United States is a man by the name of Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions is quoted as saying that he liked the Ku Klux Klan, which is an organization that has historically persecuted and had racial positions against blacks, even doing some actions that were very frightening in terms of acting against, black members of our communities across the United States. He said he liked this organization until he found out that they use marijuana, or that some of them use marijuana. So we're possibly entering into a period of very much changing politics in terms of social policy in every area in the United States, in terms of environmental health, in terms of public health, and in terms of drug policy. And so I think that any seeming tolerance of ayahuasca use in the United States over the past, decades is not necessarily anything that we can count on in the future. And there are clearly avenues open for people who are not licensed to be prosecuted. And it depends a lot, again, on local authorities. And I think that the best way for people to secure your rights is through the outline that I've given already in terms of integrity and sincerity and having a legitimate religious practice and responsibility and a lineage that you're following and all these elements. And then being responsible, screening the people who are coming into your group, knowing what people are doing this for, not doing anything that could be considered to be corruptive or exploitive, because it's there by no means are these rights fully secured, and people need to be intelligent, conscientious, and responsible in their practice.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I just want to wrap up on the same lines, saying that the importance in the current political scenario in the US, not only in the US, but in Brazil and so many other countries, is that really that us as a community do what anthropologists commonly call cultural and informal means of controls. That means that we teach each other, that we inform each other, that we educate each other, that we talk to each other, that we exchange informations in order to create better practices, to create more safe uses of ayahuasca, more responsible uses of ayahuasca. And the basic idea of this branch of the ADF, as I said in the beginning, we are also supporting legal cases, so we're providing help for people that have been arrested or persecuted. But an immense and huge important dimension of this work is education and prevention information. So it's better to avoid getting arrested. It's better to get educated, to get well informed on your rights and your responsibilities. And remember that with rights, always responsibilities come. And so the objective of this webinar is to teach people to get informed and to be a counter voice in the river of misinformation that is produced by sensationalistic media, by superficial approaches that pathologize ayahuasca, criminalize ayahuasca, put ayahuasca as a strong perversion or delusion, but also, unfortunately, sometimes from perspectives that can come from the ayahuasca community itself, providing not accurate information about legal status or miraculous cures or panacea views. So we invite all of you to join our webinar series, to be connected on our efforts. And I'd like to give a special thanks to all the team that has made this effort possible, to Jero that is doing the technical part. We have been thrilled to move to this new technological momentum of our little group. We're very few people. We would like to thank all of you who have generously donated for this initiative and had faith in our intentions and in our projects. And this is one of the first and most important outcomes of this initiative. We are posting all of this free content. Everything will be recorded. Links will be available. So stay tuned on our ADF Facebook page and ICEER's newsletter and our blog. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, not only for your webinar contribution and for your patience, but also for your dedication, your courage, your passion, and for volunteering to be here with us and doing this opening. I am very happy with the content, with the results, and we'll keep you posted. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.